My name is Tim Carter. This is another lesson from Cornell University. This one is about something very interesting to demonstrate the power of priming, and talking, the power of talk rather than the text, but then watch just how superior God's Word is to this. For example, in the topic of eschatology, people dare not engage it because you're taught now you might as well just be a pre-tribber so that you don't take the abuse and incur the wrath of those who will punish you if you're not. Well, that's called persecution. Pressure is coercive power. It's not a power as the Bible teaches that is attained through education, which is the expert power, which helps is someone that is favorably disposed to helping others, people of goodwill, for example, as we're taught as pastors to be patient with people. So you dare not say post-trib, because then you're saying people are going through the Great Tribulation. And if you don't say pre-trib, then you're accused of saying people go through. And yet, this is why people can't hear. You might notice something interesting about this word hear. The root word is ear. Notice that. So people can't hear you, if you will, in this unusual manner, because it's something about this here. But in Revelation 7, which is a number 7, which is easy, 14 is times that too, there's a statement there in our Bible, and we all read it, and it says people, it speaks of people who came out of, and it speaks of great tribulation. Great tribulation. So there's the tribulation, the great, an unsurpassed, unprecedented time identified very definitively. There's people, however, here, people who came out of it. So out from, let's say, that means they're alive. They survived. Means that although there were many who bled, as Jesus said, some would be taken before the magistrates. We now have the record of martyrologies. We don't have to speculate. We have Martyr's Mirror. You can go online and look at Martyr's Mirror online, read it free of charge. Of course, it costs people their lives to produce it, to record it, to guard it, to keep it, because striking feature of Martyr's Mirror, it shows Catholic and Protestant orders persecuting a certain group of people. So those who came out from, so there were those who bled and the rest who fled, as Jesus said. And what's interesting is we have a pastor here, a young man, he teaches a class with people who don't have the computer source. They'll never see this video. They don't subscribe to this, but they are so concerned that are you saying you're not pre-trib, and they're so primed and preconditioned that they can't hear him. So for example, you say, well, Brother Carter, what do you teach? What do you do if you're in a class and you're teaching church history? You mean the history of the Lord's churches, of people who are called out, like those who were baptized by John, who then went as those who were no longer practicing John's baptism, because his baptism ended for the purpose of it was to manifest Jesus as the Messiah. Well, then those people that he had baptized went out and they began to baptize. We call those people the church in our English language, but they're the called out, that assembly there that follow with Jesus. They went out and began what we call church baptism. So no degree of difficulty there. But when the forces of Judaism and the Roman Empire, which had colluded and conspired as the religious leaders turned Jesus over to have him crucified by the Romans, well, he had said within that generation terrible calamities would befall them. He even mentioned it. We don't need to really dispute the details of that, but it's remarkable that when I'm teaching a class, I'm in the class teaching about these people, these Jesus followers who were baptized Jews, many of them who had come out of the Jews' religion and were now followers of Jesus. And then that very early time of Jesus, we notice that virtually all of the members of that first church were baptized Jews, and that's long before the day of Pentecost. They were walking with Jesus. They were then baptizing with Jesus there with them. And interesting, as I'm teaching this, and then I come to 70 A.D., and I talking about those Christ followers who listened to Jesus and did not go into their homes to take their possessions, but fled. And in the middle of the teaching, someone stops and says, "But are you pre-trib?" And I'm saying, well, I'm teaching about these people who fled tribulation, fled pressure. I'm teaching about the people who bled. And then as I then show them the next logical outcome or collateral effect from that destruction of the city of Jerusalem, in which people who fell for the deception of peace and safety taught by the Jewish religion's leaders, 1.1 million people died. How tragic, how devastating when those forces collided, and innocent people trapped in there. And certainly it was nothing God had to do of any deliberate effort of his own. Those two forces collided. He had sent his son to call people to come out, the people who believed and listened, those who went and made disciples. Those disciples listened, followed, fled. Some bled, some couldn't escape because they were taken into custody. As we know, even Paul was lost his life by persecution by Caesar Nero. And you can even read in history where they began to cut people's heads off. It's terrible. Now, that's a long story short to say that then the next logical extension is the Roman Empire began to have Caesars rise up. I would be teaching about the people they were persecuting as the Jews' religion would then agitate and cause trouble again. Synagogues of opposition to Christ followers would then literally, as Antipas, who the word antipos, anti, against, pos, all, he is against all of it. He was martyred, and we know about Polycarp. So I'll be teaching that, and people stop and say, but are you pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, are you pre-wrath? And I keep saying, well, the Bible doesn't teach that we go through the Great Tribulation. There's not a verse that says we go through the Great. It said we come out from it. So I continued on and showed them how, following the Roman emperors and the Caesars who persecuted us and caused so much bloodshed, then the religious tyrants rose up and began inquisitions, which even in their own religion they have records of it, and they acknowledge it, and they regret it, and they lament it. But of course, what's that have to do with what the Bible's teaching? So again, I'm teaching about the Christ followers, those who believe the gospel, who come out and receive the profession of faith conferred upon them, who come out and assemble together, who then fellowship into the gospel and memorialize Christ, his broken body and shed blood, and then they go out and make disciples. And I'm continuing on, and then I get to kings on the earth who rose up, and then how these Christ followers who believed the gospel, who came out and were baptized, and by being baptized were then made a gazing stock, and then placed in the precarious position of being threatened and persecuted again. And under these tyrannical kings, they had their rights taken from, even their Bibles outlawed, because of a king's presumption that he can authorize one. So as I'm preaching and teaching about how we fled here, and then we fled here and we came to be here in the United States and how it originated, and I quote the framers of our Constitution, the political scientists, and I talk about how they collaborated with the people called Baptist Anabaptizers, Baptists, baptized believers who would not ally themselves with state-established religion. And we're in a country that does not allow religion to commandeer our government. We have a wall of separation long before the wall Donald Trump, president of the United States, wants to build. We already have a wall that can't be scaled. So as I'm teaching this and showing this and adding value and the proper glory to Christ in his church and the value of it, people still ask, but are you pre-trib? Because if you're not pre-trib, you're saying we're going through. I said, there's no verse in the Bible that says, and this is the same word from which we get our word Exodus. EX, out from, odos, way. So we are the people that fled. Now, what do we do today? There's nowhere to flee. Well, there's only one thing remains for Jesus to return. Then we who are his, alive and remain, those who are dead in Christ will be raised when he returns, and we simultaneously will be seized away with them. So I'm not sure what pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, and pre-wrath are, but in a word, I will say definitively they appear to be solutions to a problem that does not exist for God's people. It's problem enough to always be in the pressure of the colliding forces. And I find it very convenient for people to say, are you a preterist, historicist, futurist, or a spiritualist, or an idealist, whatever they say in these artificial partitions. I say, well, since we lived through all of that, since we are the ones who authored the book of Revelation, since we were the ones there who fled from the city, since we were the ones who not only did we flee, but many of us bled, and then not only were we the ones being persecuted by Roman emperors, and later by religious tyrants, and later by tyrannical kings, but we have a future that awaits us, and no, we don't have a need for anything but to wait on the return of Christ, look for His coming, our blessed hope, the certainty that delivers us from the despair that would otherwise overwhelm us. And interestingly enough, I still am asked questions, but are you pre-trib, are you mid-trib, are you post-trib, are you pre-wrath? And I keep wanting to know, and if you can give some feedback why people prescribe solutions for problems that don't exist for the Lord's churches, maybe they're not one of the Lord's churches because their solutions not being applicable to us, and we being the only faith from the time of Christ when He called us out from those that John had baptized, and then we along with Christ began to baptize. He was there with them, us then, us today, and they went out faithful, and they were the ones who, having made disciples before 70 AD, those people came out and fled. And regrettably, people bled. And we have the trail of blood. The trail of blood for the Old Testament, Jesus Himself mentioned it, all the way from Abel to Zechariah. So Jesus acknowledged a trail of blood in the Old Testament. We've tried to construct one as fallibly as we, in spite of our fallibilities, the trail of blood since then, which we people might question the accuracy of some of the data, since people at the time worked with what they had, but we can't dispute the fact there's a trail of blood that Jesus referenced in His lifetime. There's a trail of blood since then, but since the Bible, and I don't know who's done it, but no matter when I teach, no matter what class or when I'm preaching in the pulpit, people still want to know, and it's the power of priming and pre-conditioning people so that they presume that if you aren't pre-trib, then you're saying we're going through the Great Tribulation, and then they can't hear a word you're saying. So the truth that we come out from that, so we don't have anywhere to flee. All we have is to go up and meet Christ in the air. Now, if you want to get involved in logistics after that and somehow line all that out, you go ahead and impugn and punish and persecute and pressure God's people, but it's nothing new for us. It's occurred from the time John was faced inquisitors who came out and said, "Who are you and what are you doing?" So from the time of John the Baptist preacher till today, the preachers are still being questioned, called to question, asked, "Who do we think we are?" We don't ask them. I don't ask. I don't ask Catholic or Protestant or Judaic or Islamic or occultic or New Age or even denominationals, are you pre-trib or not? What difference does it make to them? What does it even have to do with them? So I think perhaps over time the leaven of such things has been demonstrated once again, that God's people were susceptible to it. We are receptive to the leaven of the kingdom of God, and we are susceptible to the leaven of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy and pretense. So they're prescribing solutions for us, and maybe we've appropriated some of those. Construct appropriation is what I call it. But this is just an example of what it means when people can't hear. They can't hear you because they're so primed and ready and coiled with stored energy that immediately, if you don't acknowledge one of the fallible expressions such as pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, pre-wrath, or whatever else is out there, Pantrip. Someone told me Pantrip is where people say it'll all pan out. Well, okay, but we have our Bible. So when someone asks me, "Who are these people?" I say, "Oh, those are the Baptists." Those are those baptized believers. And yes, they have themselves between a rock and a hard place. The word tribulation is from where we get tribology, the study of friction and pressure, where two forces come together and create a frictive reality. And it's studied in science when it comes to parts that wear and friction, and we all know about it in our motorized vehicles and in things that machinery in our mechanized, industrialized society. So I'm not sure why this is a problem, but I certainly love preaching, teaching eschatology from the time the book of Revelation was written, and the history of Christ's followers who dared believe the gospel, who were then blood-bought, baptized, who dared to come out and sever their ties, who dared to then assemble peaceably as the First Amendment was acknowledged, the right to peaceably assemble. That's a inalienable right to assemble. That's a church inalienable right. And we have peaceably assembled here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, as a New Testament, New Covenant church under the headship of Jesus. He's fully here. Apparently it's okay. in our culture, because we have those inalienable rights acknowledged by those who, the framers, the secularists of our culture, valued our willingness to champion and advocate the freedom of conscience, thought, and speech, because the power in our faith is our message, and in our message is the power of God unto salvation for anyone who believes it. So, just to say, this is a good example of why I personally, because I don't want to put this reproach on anyone else, but just why I personally, for example, can say I'm not pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, or pre-wrath, or pan-trib, because none of them are necessary solutions for the problem for which they have been prescribed. Does not exist in the Bible for the Lord's Church. So you have a blessed day. Enjoy this. Enjoy the conversation. When you find people, they'll be intrigued when you start talking about who were the people who fled, and you tell them what they believe, what gospel they believe, what baptism they practiced, what fellowship they had, which was into the gospel, what commission they were given. And then you show them under the persecution of emperors, and you show them under the persecution of religious tyrants, and then you show them under tyrannical kings, and you then show them the logical conclusion was what resulted in what we know today, the United States, a separation of church, religious power, and state power, and that there's a wall of separation. And that was written from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association concerning the heart of the Baptists, and their chief concern was, we do not wish to have our inalienable right of peaceable assembly and freedom of speech taken away, and that has been guarded and secured by the grace of God. So whatever you want to say about pre-trib and then ridicule someone who doesn't go along, be careful not to be speaking against the Lord's church. Be careful what you say about post-trib and whatever. It might be better if you just erase those topics, have a substantial understanding of the history of the faith once delivered, and the power of the gospel to prevail all things, for even the gates of Hades have not been able to conquer the prevalent nature and reality of the Lord's church. So you have a blessed day, and here's a good lesson and what can happen when people can't hear you. Have a blessed day.